My name is Alan Marsh. It is Saturday, May the 27th, of the year 2000. We're at the Atlanta History Center this Memorial Day weekend. Our interview this morning is with Mr. Ken Griffiths, who is in the U.S. Navy JAG Corps.
Army.
U.S. Army. Never believe what you read.
Maybe that means the person who wrote that thought I was a gentleman.
Watches the TV show.
Right.
Mr. Griffiths resides here in the Atlanta area, and we'll be discussing his experience over in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Hard to believe that 25 years ago,
30 years ago.
Saigon and
Right.
A lot of think about high school students graduating 18 years old. This is ancient history to them.
If history at all.
So hopefully these tapes will serve and interviews will serve a useful purpose and in the archives here at the Atlanta History Center. If we could, though, just begin this morning by telling us where before you got into the military, just a little background information on where you lived and what you were doing, and of course you mentioned earlier your ROTC. So
Right. I had gone to the Georgia Military Academy here in Atlanta, Georgia. It's now Woodward, and had left there in 1960, had gone to Florida State and received a degree as well as a commission in the infantry as a second lieutenant. And thereafter, I immediately went to the University of Florida Law School. I graduated there in 1966 and was fortunate enough to pass the bar, because passing the bar was the one thing I had left to do to actually enter the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the Army. Almost immediately after that, I went on active duty January of 1967 and reported to the Judge Advocate General School in Charlottesville, Virginia. Had a year at Fort Gordon defending criminals accused of military crimes, and then volunteered to go to Vietnam, and went there in April of 1968.
So what were your feelings as far as going over to Southeast Asia? Any particular emotions or thoughts at the time?
Well, they varied. I was nervous. It was an adventure, and I'd never done anything like that before, and I was very uncertain as to what I was going to be confronting, both from a professional standpoint and the living conditions and the fact that there was a war going on. But I had felt as though it was the right thing to do, and thought that America's position as it related to what was taking place in Indochina or Vietnam at that point was the right thing to do. We were not there for treasure or glory, and as it turned out, we certainly got neither. But part of it was clearly I was a young man, and there was a sense of adventure about it.
What about your family, their reaction?
Well, I'm sure my father thought I was a fool. My father had served in World War II as an entomologist in the Pacific, and I'm sure he thought that while that may have been an adventure for him, that he would have been just as well served individually to have stayed home, and I'm certain my mother was frightened about it. My brother was delighted. He got the Porsche.
So go ahead and just kind of trace your route from...
I went home from Fort Gordon to visit with my family for a short period of time, and then left from Tampa Airport and flew out to Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco, and got to see San Francisco for the first time. Boarded an airplane there, and as I look back over my right shoulder after getting on that airplane, I don't believe I'd ever seen quite so many people in such a long airplane, and we were crowded in, not like cattle, but certainly there wasn't a lot of extra room. We flew from San Francisco to Hawaii, from there to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and from there to Bien Hoa in Vietnam, where we were entertained royally by the folks at the 90th Replacement Depot, and that was my introduction to Vietnam. Getting off the airplane, frankly, I wasn't sure I had left. It looked like a strange combination of Georgia and Florida to me. Lots of red clay, but palm trees, lots of lush vegetation. And having grown up in both of those areas, it almost felt as though I hadn't left home. But
and where were you stationed?
after we left Bien Hoa, we went into Saigon. We had a 2-day or 3-day orientation, and then my initial assignment was as a foreign claims officer in the Office of the Staff Judge Advocate at MACV, which was the Military Assistance Command for Vietnam. That was the senior headquarters in Vietnam. And my office, of all things, was in downtown Saigon in a building we called the Tax Building, right across the street from the Rex Hotel, and just kind of catty corner from the Continental Palace, and which was a big hotel, and just blocks away from the Presidential Palace and the American Embassy. So we were just in right downtown Saigon.
So it wasn't like you were off somewhere and the war was a totally foreign thing to you. Tet Offensive, which had started earlier in the year.
Well, that's quite correct. I had arrived in May, and the first place that I lived was in Cholon in an officer's billet down there, a BOQ, and I had wondered why the soldiers in my office were so quick to give me the Jeep and let me drive myself down to the Chinese section of the city. And what I discovered shortly after I'd been there was the war was still going on just across the river and at the Y Bridge, which was within a block or two of the BOQ. And as I alluded to earlier, we spent our evenings drinking rum and wink on the upper deck or roof of the building and listening to a fellow play bagpipe music, and watch the gunships work the area just across the river from us. In fact, I recall the one incident in which gunship passed over our heads, and shortly thereafter we had a hail of brass spent cartridges on the corrugated fiberglass that covered our heads there. So the war was going on. There were people dying not far away. For me, it was a little bit like watching a movie, frankly.
And what was your age and rank at this time?
I was, because lawyers are so important to the United States Army, I had gotten promoted from my commissioning rank as a second lieutenant to captain. Most Army lawyers arrive as captains and depart as captains, and I was, I guess, roughly 26 years of age or so.
And you mentioned foreign claims. Tell me a little bit about what your actual duties were. Well, first of all, you were over in Southeast Asia for how many?
I was there about 13 months in country, as it was expressed, and I served for the first 6 months at MACV, and then we were transferred. Our responsibilities were transferred to what was called USARV, U.S. Army Vietnam, still part of the Staff Judge Advocate's office, but I guess they discovered we weren't nearly as important as we thought we were. What the foreign claims operation did was the American government, in its wisdom, said if we injured people while we were present in Vietnam, that if it was not the result of combat activity, then people ought to be compensated. If a GI driving a Jeep going to pick up something at the PX ran over somebody, then those folks ought to be compensated. If we killed a water buffalo as a result of negligence, then that ought to be compensated. So we received police reports of events that were potentially compensable under the Foreign Claims Act, and we had interviews from judge advocates or military policemen who were on the scene or were a part of that, and those reports or files were shipped to us, and we made a determination as to the compensation, whether it was compensable or not, number one, and then the amount or level of compensation that the injured party would receive. There were one-man foreign claims commissions, and I was one of those, and then there were three-man or three-person foreign claims commissions, and I was also on that particular board. The jurisdictional difference was, I think, claims of over $25,000 could be considered by the three-man board, and we received these just as sort of appellate judges receive things now. We had the facts in front of us. There was no advocate, particularly for one side or the other. We had translators who translated documents from Vietnamese or French into English, and then we made a decision. We wrote opinions and voted, and we had lots of 2-to-1 determinations. We had two good lawyers there, as well as myself, Frank Gendhart from Pennsylvania, and Jack Mullins, who was the in charge of the office from Texas, and it was philosophical bents and interpretations of the law were something we all enjoyed expressing.
That sounds like what you were doing then involved working with or dealing with both military and civilians?
Absolutely, because most of the claims that were presented were civilians, and they could present the claim either by appearing in person in our office in Saigon or at any one of the judge advocate stations throughout the four corps of or four provinces of Vietnam. And if they came in, they were interviewed there by our interpreters, and if they presented the claim by letter form, we simply got the letter at some point or other. So, but almost all the claims were as a result of, or the petitioners were almost always civilians.
So you examined the information. Did you ever have to go out into the public?
Well, we got that opportunity. If we wanted to visit a site, we could, and we had an office in Da Nang, and from time to time I would go up to Da Nang. Recalls I had written my mother and dad and said I was going to Da Nang. I think maybe it was the first time, and I'd gotten out to get on the Air America flight leaving from Bien Hoa, and which was a C-47 or an old DC-3, and things hadn't changed much from World War II at that point, and they said that the airfield in Da Nang was receiving lots of shell fire, so they didn't know whether they were going to take the flight up there or not. Since my trip wasn't absolutely mandatory, I decided that discretion was the better part of valor and got off the airplane. A week later or so, I got a letter from my dad saying, in the future, don't write us letters telling us where you're going, write us letters telling us where you've been. He said, otherwise it makes your mother nervous to think that you're going someplace and reading about it or hearing about it on television and wondering what happened to her son. So
understandable. Because there was quite a bit of news.
That's right.
And in communication, well, before I leave civilians, any comments you want to make with any interaction with civilians, whether it was through business, I mean, through your job?
Well, the Vietnamese generally I found to be an extremely attractive group of people. The women with their out eyes were as beautiful and graceful a group of female creatures as one is likely to encounter, and I thought that there was a great level of inventiveness on the part of the Vietnamese. You would see on the street corners people working on motorbikes or bicycles with the most primitive tools of a charcoal brazier working so they could heat metal and pound it out, and they kept things running that of course we here in the United States would simply throw away. In fact, I think they often repaired things that we had thrown away. But there was a dedication to hard work to watch these men and women squatting beside these on these street corners, working with metal and keeping pieces of equipment going, I was quite impressed. It's a hard-working group of people. You'd see them in the rice paddies. Stoop labor is, if you've ever done it yourself, you never really get fully conditioned to it, but these folks worked hard day after day after day. And as I say, I found them to be generally a warm and hospitable group of people. Since I lived in Saigon, my exposure to country people was probably not as great as it might have been, but I know I would often, on my walk back to the after office hours, I would walk back to the hotel, and there was a family that lived in a hotel on the corner, and I'd often stop and chat. Not that they understood me or that I understood them, but and the little girl, who was probably 2 or 3, loved the fact that that I had hair on my arms. Vietnamese don't have as much hair on their bodies as many of us Americans, as many of we do, and she would rub my arm, and I would talk to her father and play with her baby brother, who was in a stroller at the time. Children in Vietnam played an interesting game. They had a ring that would fit around their foot or ankle, and a string was attached to that and a weight at the other end of it, and they would, in effect, jump rope as this swing, as this weight and their motion propelled this hula hoop thing around at their foot level, and they were it was a pleasant thing to watch. The city of Saigon, frankly, was a beautiful place, terribly overcrowded at that point. If there were 13 million people, I'm sure I didn't see them all, but occasionally traffic jams looked like maybe all 13 million were involved. Traffic jams were often cleared by the Vietnamese police firing their weapons into the air. Theoretically, that encouraged people to take cover, and the traffic jams that especially occurred around these traffic circles that we've been wise enough only to incorporate in this country in Washington, D.C., sometimes then quickly disperse. But it was quite a combination to see everything from horse-drawn carriages to pedicabs, which individual Vietnamese drivers pedaled a bicycle with a place for people to sit behind it, and to seeing American troops in armored personnel carriers or heavy semi-tractor trailer trucks trying to move through these roads that the French had really designed for horse and buggy times. So it was an interesting contrast of old and new, and but it was, and I believe probably today still is, geographically quite a beautiful place.
How did people seem to handle the war? I mean, you're there at Saigon. I mean,
as far as I could tell, there wasn't really a war going on. I mean, obviously there were lots of GIs in the streets, and at night you would often be able to see, because it was night, you'd be able to see firefights in the distance, especially if aircraft were involved. But the ordinary people in the street, as far as I could tell, simply went about the business of trying to stay alive. They were constantly selling goods on the sidewalk, cut flowers to American cigarettes to Johnny Walker Scotch, and these were the so-called black marketeers. But most people simply went about their business. Good restaurants stayed in business in downtown Saigon, and there were, if you traveled to Cholon, the Chinese merchants in Cholon, a very entrepreneurial group, you could look through the doors, and there would be bags of rice and other commodities for sale. And I think South Vietnam, especially Saigon, was a very bustling enterprise area, and that's really what struck me. I guess the other thing that struck me candidly is that in one or two instances when we were rocketed, or when buildings were shelled in some fashion or other, as one of the big food market areas was shortly after I had arrived, to read about that later in the press, having stood there, there seemed to be quite a contrast between what the reporter had envisioned or seen, contrasted with my own perhaps more narrow view of what took place. And that was the first instance in which I'd ever been exposed to the fact that everything I read in Time magazine wasn't necessarily the way I would have called it had I been the one doing the reporting. The devastation that they reported, while there was devastation, clearly you'd have thought the whole city had ground to a halt, and candidly, the city didn't grind to a halt at all. The public continued to go about their day-to-day business.
So the media tended to portray things a little bit more dramatic than perhaps it was in cases like that?
Well, at least that was my impression, that it was a more horrific, more horrendous situation than, and maybe that's the way maybe that's the way the entrepreneurial spirit works in reporters. Maybe that story gets put in the pages of Time magazine, and I don't mean to pick on Time, but maybe that's what gets put in there rather than one that's a little more low-key.
And it's just like in everything, there's a competition.
Absolutely, and as a proponent of that, I like to think that we usually get the best as a result. There was a peculiar kind of schizophrenia, if you will. Working in downtown Saigon, I worked right across the street from the Rex Hotel. Every day at lunch, my lunch routine was to walk up the 9, 10, or 11 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator, and I got so I could do that pretty well. There was a swimming pool at the top of the Rex Hotel, and usually I'd swim for a few minutes and have a sandwich and a can of American beer before going back to the office. And candidly, I knew that there were lots of South Vietnamese troops and lots of American troops, lots of Australian troops, lots of Korean troops who didn't even begin to enjoy on leave what I enjoyed day to day. In the evenings at the Officers Club on top of the Rex Hotel, we cooked our own steak and had a bottle of wine and a fresh salad, and it was, frankly, it was the best life one could imagine if you could divorce yourself from the fact that probably not very far away throughout that country, freedom was under assault and young men were dying.
So it sounds like perhaps it's carried over from your initial arrival of looking at things almost like from a distance or in a movie you're referring to, like watching it.
Well, there was almost a surreal Alice in Wonderland feeling about this. I didn't know where I was going to be stationed when I got there. As far as I knew, I was going to be in the jungle or at a fire base of some sort providing legal services, but as it turned out, either I was very fortunate or it may have been that the colonel in charge of MACV, the Hank Ivey, who had been my SJA at Fort Gordon, was looking out for me. Maybe I hadn't made him quite as angry as I thought I had. So while sometimes I regretted the fact that I was not serving as an infantry lieutenant, and as years passed and the My Lai massacre situation revealed itself, I thought perhaps those of us who might have been better prepared to be infantry lieutenants, the fact that we had either avoided the war completely or had served in a staff capacity, that perhaps that had been misplaced. I'm not saying that I would have handled it better. I would like to think that I would have handled it better.
You mentioned, you used the word regret. Any other feelings? I mean, and understand too, we both do that. Have lots of jobs in the military, and somebody has to fill those jobs to go where you're ordered to go.
Sure.
But were there? Did you ever feel any sense when you got over there of guilt or anything that you were there? I mean, you said
Oh, no. I never had that. As I say, I think the motives that under which most Americans participated, first, I'd gotten orders to go, and I'd volunteered to go because I thought the rightness of our position was absolute. There was nothing for America to gain in the short term other than to maintain a firewall between a system of government, the communist totalitarian form of government, contrasted with a potential for a far more democratic system in the South, and I thought those were the best of instincts. I thought, frankly, that made real and absolute the American values that, as a Cub Scout, an Eagle Scout, junior ROTC, and student of history that I sort of fancied myself. I thought those were the very best of American values, and because we got the United States received nothing for its vast expenditure of young men and treasure. We weren't there as the French had been as a colonial power. We were there really, I think, as a buttress for the free world.
Is that what, also the feeling that you gathered in your dealings with both military and also the civilians through the foreign claims? Was that kind of feeling that you gathered others?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I don't know, never knew the background of all the people who presented claims, but as we know from history and knew at that point, when the communists got their hands firmly wrapped around what we now call North Vietnam, or then called North Vietnam, over 1 million people left that part of the country and walked to South Vietnam to escape that form of tyranny and lack of freedom. And nobody's going to make an excuse that says the South Vietnamese government, the Republic of Vietnam, was a democratic paradise. It wasn't. But candidly, most newly democratic governments have their own excesses. When I think you see it, you probably saw it in New York City when the Irish finally took over from being the lowest of the low to actually running the city. There probably were excesses that today we would not be proud of. I suspect you've seen it in southern cities when blacks have taken over government. We've probably had excesses that that nobody's particularly enthusiastic about. So without making too much of those parallels, it wasn't perfect, but it was far more free, even with the difficulties that a wartime, newly formed representative government would have in South Vietnam. And it was relatively free, or at least it appeared that way to me.
Well, I can tell that you definitely now, and I'm sure when you came back from Vietnam, felt the same way as when you went over there. Earlier you said it was the right thing to do.
Oh, no question about it. Other people have different points of view. I often think that there is a naivete that young people have who aren't students of history. Perhaps I had it as well, but the war protests that took place in this country, nobody's enthusiastic about war. Mostly those people who have participated in it are not enthusiastic about it. But what we're talking about is motivation and motive, and I think the motives here were as pure as the driven snow.
You mentioned some folks back home. Of course, you have anti-war movement, etc. How much of that? How much did you hear about what was happening in the States, which, or as far as any anti-war movement? And of course, this is 68, 69 that you were over.
Right.
In Vietnam.
Right.
But
well, I had been raised in the South, and I would suspect that if we examine what took place, there was less anti-war feeling manifested at Southern universities than there were in Northeastern or California universities, certainly in the beginning. And our access to information from the United States, we got newspapers and news magazines, and saw occasionally television. I remember sitting in the officers club of the BOQ in which I lived, watching Lyndon Johnson say he wasn't going to run again. But I don't think I don't think that I was affected particularly, or knew that that there was this anti-war sentiment that was expressing itself to the degree that lots of people suggest that it was. There was tremendous anti-war sentiment during the American Civil War. The draft riots in New York left people dead on the streets, and I know that there was a sentiment that was strong against the United States participation in World War I and World War II. How different that really was, I think sometimes we think it's more unique because it's happening to us, but I would suggest that we replay history over and over again.
And I want to ask this: were there any particular cases or claims that you want to remember well, or you don't want to share with us?
Well, the one that, I mean, most of them were pretty run-of-the-mill, and I don't mean to denigrate the loss of a child, or the loss of a bicycle, or the loss of a buffalo or a cart, because after all, those represented the assets that a family had to live and work with, and they were definitely difficult to replace. But I do recall that when I arrived, we had first we had lots of claims that had been sitting, and with the fervor of a newly arrived young officer, I felt like it was my responsibility to get those things out of there. So frankly, we cleaned up. I think we had a backlog, if I recall correctly, 2,500 to 3,000 claims, and we got rid of those. By got rid of, I mean we resolved those claims. They came to closure one way or the other, and so we did that, and I felt like that was a good legal/management thing to do. But the thing that the biggest claim we had was a claim by a group of farmers who had submitted a claim for the facility that we had at Long Binh, which was a tremendous logistics base and the headquarters of the U.S. Army in Vietnam, as well as the 1st Log Command. I don't know how many acres at this point the claim encompassed, or hectares as they said, but it was a huge claim, millions of dollars, and so I decided that this claim too needed to be resolved. It had been sitting there for a long period of time, so I can remember that Frank Gendhart and I went to the embassy in search of the fundamental law as to how we were there and what the invitation was, and we discovered what was called the trilateral agreement, which was a vaguely written, very short paragraph that in effect said that each side would sort of take care of their own claims, and we concluded after a long investigation that this was really an obligation of the South Vietnamese government. That may have simply meant that the United States was going to pay it through a different channel, but that it was not a claim that was compensable under the Foreign Claims Act. And I guess one of the things that still sticks out in my mind is we were interviewing one of the senior lawyers at the embassy, and there was a knock on the door, and Hank Ivey, who was a full colonel, and that's a long way from being a captain, walked in and saw his two young JAG officers sitting there interviewing the senior individual at the U.S. Embassy, and the look on his face and the surprise and concern, he vocalized that with, "What are you two doing here?" We explained ourselves, and I think he was satisfied, but it was, while not the same as being shot at least from a legal standpoint, we had to stand up and be counted. So we resolved that claim, and I don't know whatever happened to it, because after it got shipped back to Fort Hollyburg in Maryland, we didn't hear about it to the claim service. But I do take some pride in the fact that we didn't ignore it, that we did push it forward.
So you really, for most of the claims, you really don't know what the end result was after it left your office?
Well, in most of the instances, I know, because if we paid the claim, people came to our office for payment. They had a voucher issued, and they could get piasters. So we know often, but in this instance, because of the size and magnitude of it, we just lack the jurisdictional authority to resolve it. Otherwise, we would have. It was fun being a judge, and it was making decisions in that regard. I think were important ultimately to the military presence there, and I think it sets us apart. I don't know that much about every other Western Army, and I certainly don't know that much about other armies in the past, but the idea that claims were made and paid, I know from my reading of history, in Civil War times, if somebody came and took your horses, they might give you a receipt, and I've read some of those things where claims were denied for a variety of reasons. But I think the American Army in many ways was, if not unique, at least we went about it in a very organized fashion, that we didn't want to burden people with our acts of negligence. And in that regard, we paid the claims of the Australians, and we paid the claims of the Republic of Korea troops who were there. And I guess that was one of the sort of expanding experiences. I got to know a number of Australian lawyers, got to know a number of Korean attorneys, and it made me feel that I was a part of something that was that Western form of jurisprudence, that individual rights and responsibilities. It was important to be a part of that.
Still, my mind is boggled with the thought of having 3,000 claims laying there.
Mine was as well. And I felt a little bit when we arrived. The Tet Offensive was just over, and we had a number of American legal clerks in the office, and these guys were all armed as though combat was about to visit itself at our very doors. And the number of shotguns and M14s and other weapons was just overwhelming, and it bothered me tremendously that we had loaded weapons just sort of carelessly about in the office. So like every good Western marshal, I said, we really ought to be locking these guns up in a closet during the day, or at least have them pointing up in the air. So that, along with the literally stacks of claims that we had, was a little bit overwhelming to a youngster from a small Central Florida rural community at that point.
Well, let's go ahead and get you back to Florida or Georgia and into the States here. You were there for about 13 months?
About 13 months, and then I came back. The Army Judge Advocates, reserve officers, all had 4 years to serve. Regulars, for some peculiar reason, only were burdened with 3 years of service to their country. But I came back and spent a year at the Pentagon doing what the Army calls retail legal assistance, and holding people's hands, writing wills, giving general legal advice. And then for my last year of service, I spent about a year at Bailey's Crossroads outside of Washington, D.C., arguing criminal appellate briefs as a defense attorney. And that was all interesting and exciting to me. I got out of the service in January of 1971, went back to Florida, looked for work. Can only assume that most of the resumes I sent out were lost in the mail, but did receive an offer and came back to Atlanta and accepted a position at the CocaCola company.
And you said back to Atlanta because you'd gone to school here?
Gone to school here earlier, and I had been at Fort Gordon, Georgia during my first tour of duty.
So what year was it that you got the job with CocaCola? Coca-Cola company?
I came to Coke in May of 1971. I'll give you what I think is a humorous story. I had been home trying to do a good job as a son at that point, having been gone for 13 months, and had come back with my new Corvette automobile and all of my belongings in one suitcase. But I mowed the grass and made sure the dishes got washed and did my own laundry and tried to help around the house. But one morning about 6, when my dad usually got up, I could hear him rustling around in the kitchen making his oatmeal that he's made for these now 80 years or so. And he came in and shook me lightly on the shoulder and awakened me and looked at me and said, "Son, it's time for you to find work." So shortly thereafter, I accepted the job at the Coca-Cola company.
And are you still with Coke now?
No, I left Coke in 1981 and went into the real estate business. Roberto Gozueta, then chairman at the Coca-Cola company. I'd been fortunate enough to work with Roberto for a period of about a year, and Roberto had made had spent a lot of time talking about entrepreneurship, and the more he talked about it, the more certain I was that I really ought to be one. I couldn't spell it, but I thought I understood the concept. So I left and formed a small real estate company we've had now for about 13 years. There was I guess I went initially with a company called Rubloff out of Chicago, but we're in the commercial real estate business. We do a little bit of development and mostly tenant representation and management, but so I'm no longer purely practicing law. I did stay in the Army Reserve and achieve the rank of colonel. The most fun, I guess, was being the commander of a judge advocate detachment for Georgia and Florida, the 213th Military Law Center. Most lawyers don't get a chance to command anything, so that was interesting. And I spent about 29 years in the military, so it's been a rich and rewarding life. I'm married. I've got 2 children by a previous marriage and a 9-year-old or 8-year-old daughter at this point. So.
And so you're firmly by now in 71. You're firmly entrenched in Atlanta. This is home.
Absolutely. I won't be leaving again, as far as I know.
Do you stay in contact, or when you came back from Vietnam, did you maintain contact with any of the co-workers? You mentioned Mullins and
Gendhart. Well, in fact, I did. Frank stayed in the reserves as well, and there were a number of folks who returned from Vietnam in the JAG Corps that I saw from time to time who had stayed in the reserves. So my friendship with Frank has continued for 30 years. I have a very close friendship with another lawyer here in Atlanta named Bill Lanham. Bill's a very successful personal injury trial lawyer, and I see Bill maybe not as often as I would like to, but our friendship goes back to the time that we were both brand new captains and were roommates at Charlottesville together. So yes, I do. The other thing that I'm involved in is the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, and while there are not a lot of judge advocates who are members of that group or former judge advocates, there are a number of individuals who served in a far more normal military capacity, be they helicopter pilots or infantry officers or infantry sergeants, or whether they flew jets out of Da Nang or off of an aircraft carrier. So my admiration for them is deep and substantial, and it's a pleasure to be accepted as a comrade in arms, notwithstanding how perhaps feeble my own contributions in that regard were.
Do you think your military experience, particularly in Vietnam, affected you or changed your life, or any impact on it?
Well, I'm sure it had an impact. I think the time in the military for me was one of the things I thought about was that we brought all kinds of people together who otherwise would never have left the farm or the small town that they might have been a part of, and they got to see perhaps a homogenized view of America, but they did get to meet people from all over the United States. Certainly in my case, there were about 138 lawyers, I think, in my basic class at Charlottesville, and just to get to participate and be a part of an organization like that, these were all, by and large, very bright, well-educated people who, by and large, had volunteered to come into the Army at that point. So they were people that I felt as though I had something in common with. The world had not changed at that point. By that I mean these were almost exclusively white males. I think we had 2 black officers in my class and no females, if I remember that correctly, and I believe I do. Today the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps is more, quote, reflective, if you will, of the total population, which probably means they have very few young white male officers. But for me, it was a mind-expanding, kind of a continuation of my own education. I got to go to Hong Kong. I got to go to Australia. I got to go to Vietnam. I got to go to California, which was just as foreign, perhaps, to me then as these other places were. And it was a continuation of the education. I have no doubt that it affected me. It's the only institution of government that I have overwhelming fondness for. I think the purpose for government really is largely to protect and defend, and the Department of Defense and all too often the Army gets to be the people on the ground to do that. And the reserves was important as well. We participated by going to 7th Corps headquarters in Germany when Desert Shield was taking place, and freed those officers up to go do what they had to do in the desert while we suffered in the snow in Stuttgart. But it's all been important to me, and I think as people look back and reflect on their lives, being part of something that's bigger than simply earning a living or simply going through life day by day does take on some significance and importance to them. My little study of history tells me that the 3 or 4 years people spent during the Civil War, the time they spent during the American Revolution, were the times that they reflect on as being probably the most important, regardless of what side they might have been on. There's something about participating in history, in events that later will be judged to be historic, that I think is important to people. No, I didn't. I've had sort of a checkered marital situation. I had been married in law school and divorced, and then was married again after I got out of the Army, and was divorced about the time I left the CocaCola company. I'm now married to a young woman whose father was a naval aviator during World War II and retired as an admiral, and her 2 brothers, interestingly enough, one of whom is an author, was a Special Forces NCO in Vietnam, and her other brother, who's an editor with USA Today, she comes from a literary family, was an artillery lieutenant in Vietnam, and so I feel, or I kid myself into feeling that I'm an accepted member of the Norman family at this point, and I didn't meet Brenda until I started my new business.
Little did you know you were still all the military connections you have, right?
That's exactly right. It's exactly correct.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I just want to give you the opportunity to, if there's anything that you'd like to mention about your experience or your duties in Vietnam. We have a few minutes here.
Well, I guess one observation would be one of the things that was of interest to me while we were in Vietnam. One evening we had a group get together. We had another judge advocate from Alan Korzinski from New York, myself from the South, and then we had we had several newspaper reporters. One from Canada, one from New Zealand, one from Australia. and theoretically all of us spoke English. To tell you the truth, it was more like the Tower of Babel until we'd gotten through the first beer or two, and thereafter our understanding of each other's idiosyncratic English became much easier to understand. Everybody sounded the same. So that's one evening that I recall, but nothing else comes to mind at this point.
Well, certainly do appreciate it on behalf of the Atlanta History Center. Of course, this weekend, well, not just this weekend, they've had the Requiem exhibit up, and some exhibits still, concerning Vietnam.
And we also were invited by the History Center this week, the Vietnam Veterans Business Association, to install the monument that we install every year and to honor an individual Atlantan who gave their life in Vietnam. We were invited this year to place that monument honoring all of those people here on the grounds of the History Center. And that exhibit, as I understand it, is going to be open, or that monument is going to be open free to the public in perpetuity. And there will be other monuments placed along this walk of honor that is there, honoring those who gave their lives in all the conflicts in which the United States has participated, but we were flattered to be invited to be the first. And to some extent, Alan, I think many of the wounds of war that maybe it's just the passage of time, but people mellow. I know when we march in the Veterans Day Parade, people who stand on the street corner often say out loud as they wave to us, "We appreciate what you did. Thank you very much." And I think lots of people are overcoming some of their honestly held, although I think history would tell us that they were naive views. You just have to look at what took place in Vietnam after we ingloriously abandoned that group of folks, and but I think a lot of the rawness of emotions and points of view has dissipated over time, and it makes me proud to be an American. After all points of view ought to be heard, and with that competition we talked about earlier, maybe in the long run the best point of view emerges.
And how often in our country's history have we stood up for and fought and died for freedoms?
Absolutely.
Freedom of speech.
Well, absolutely, and that's the whole point. I mean, to be able to express yourself is maybe the single most personal freedom that we have, and it is truly important to us.
And I will agree, just from my own observations and reading as well, as far as the American public today, there does, no matter what one's views may have been at the time, for those of us
Sure.
who were around, it seems like, over time, that if you look at people now, there is a deep appreciation, just as you were saying, they understand, they appreciate sacrifice, devotion of duty.
Sure.
And I think it's a positive thing, and appreciate your devotion to duty and your time, and not only the service, but with us this morning. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Alan.